The forest was dark suffocatingly, so the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and devoured breath. Branches clawed at Mark Sullivan's arms as he stumbled forward, his boots slipping on wet leaves. Somewhere ahead, just beyond his reach, a small voice pierced the stillness, a voice that once brought him laughter, now dripping with terror. "Dad, help me." The plea echoed through the night, twisting into something almost inhuman as it reverberated among the trees. Mark's chest heaved, lungs burning, each step frantic and uncoordinated. His fingers stretched outward, desperate to seize the small shadow darting through the fog ahead. "Noah," he gasped, though the name came out strangled, a guttural sound swallowed by the oppressive mist. The forest floor shifted beneath him, slick with moss and hidden roots. His knee buckled, sending him crashing forward. Pain exploded through his body, but he forced himself up again. Ahead, he saw the outline of his little boy. Tiny shoulders he recognized instantly, the familiar way Noah's curls bounced as he ran. Mark reached fingertips, brushing the air where his son had been, when suddenly the image dissolved into darkness. The voice faded, replaced by the hollow silence of loss. "Scheiße." Mark awoke with a violent gasp. The dream clung to him like a shroud as he bolted upright in his narrow bed, the thin quilt tangled around his legs. Cold sweat coated his skin, and for a moment he could not tell where dream ended and reality began. His heart pounded so fiercely that he pressed a hand to his chest, half afraid it might burst. The cabin around him was silent, save for the whispering wind outside. Its wooden walls were lined with photographs, Noah's face in a dozen frozen moments, blowing out birthday candles, splashing in Silver Pine Lake, smiling with gap-toothed innocence. Among these personal relics were darker images, printed reports of other missing children, yellowed newspaper clippings, maps with pins marking places where search teams had combed through woods and water. Mark sat there trembling, a solitary figure surrounded by evidence of a nightmare that refused to end. 3 years had passed since Noah vanished, and yet every morning Mark woke as if it were the day after a world blurred by grief and unanswered questions. He dragged himself from the bed, splashing cold water on his face in the small, rust-stained sink. The reflection that stared back at him in the cracked mirror was a stranger, unshaven, with dark hollows beneath his eyes and lines etched deep into his brow. His once pressed uniform now hung from his shoulders, worn from countless nights patrolling a town that had grown unfamiliar. Brookhaven looked perfect from the outside. As Mark drove through the heart of town later that day, autumn leaves painted the streets in crimson and gold. Vendors set up stalls for the annual Harvest Festival, a beloved tradition that brought tourists from neighboring towns. Children skipped along the sidewalks, their laughter ringing out beneath banners that fluttered in the crisp October breeze. To the casual observer, Brookhaven was idyllic, a postcard come to life. But Mark knew better. Behind the smiles and polite greetings lurked an undercurrent of unease. The town had been shrinking ever since the mill closed. Businesses, shuttered families left, and the opioid crisis crept in through quiet back doors. The festival was a mask carefully maintained by those in power to convince everyone, including themselves, that Brookhaven was still safe. Mayor Charles Whitman stood at the center of it all, shaking hands, flashing his practiced smile as he encouraged donations for children's programs. He was the picture of integrity, a tall, commanding figure with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of charisma that won elections easily. Parents adored him. Business owners trusted him. And to most of Brookhaven, he was a savior. Mark watched him from a distance, his jaw tight. Nearby, a familiar voice broke through his thoughts. Greg Dalton. Mark's longtime partner and friend approached with easy confidence. His red hair gleamed in the afternoon sun, his grin wide and disarming. "You look like hell, Mark," Greg said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You should take a night off. Festival's coming up, you don't have to keep chasing ghosts." Mark offered a thin smile but said nothing. Words felt meaningless these days. Greg's expression softened. "I know you miss him. We all do. But you've got to take care of yourself too." Mark nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. Greg had been by his side through the worst of it, leading searches, sitting with Mark when hope seemed gone. If there was one person he trusted, it was Greg, or so he believed. Night descended, wrapping Brookhaven in a quiet that was more unsettling than peaceful. Mark's patrol route took him through empty streets, past shuttered shops and flickering street lamps. The radio on his dashboard crackled occasionally, but mostly there was silence. His mind wandered back to Noah, as it always did when the world grew still. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Mark saw movement. A small figure emerged from the shadows ahead. Barely illuminated by the amber glow of a streetlight, a boy no older than 4 walked alone, clutching a tattered teddy bear to his chest. His steps were hurried, purposeful, yet oddly silent, like a ghost drifting through the night. Mark's breath caught. From behind, the boy's silhouette was eerily familiar, the same build, the same slight sway in his walk. For an instant, Mark's heart convinced him it was Noah impossibly returned. He pulled his cruiser to the curb, switching off the engine. The world narrowed to the boy's fragile form moving against the deserted street. Mark didn't call out. Instinct told him to stay quiet, to watch. The boy crossed the street without hesitation, pausing only to glance around with exaggerated care. No frantic parent followed, no voice called his name. The teddy bear swung limply from his small hand, its fabric worn thin and patched in places. Mark slipped from the vehicle, keeping his distance as he followed. Each step was measured, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The boy moved faster, weaving through side streets and narrow alleys until the glow of the town faded behind them. The path ahead was darker now, flanked by trees that seemed to close in like sentinels. Mark knew where they were headed even before he saw the silhouette rising against the moonlight St. Helena's Orphanage. The building had been abandoned for decades, left to rot after a fire gutted part of its east wing. Locals whispered that it was haunted, a place of lingering sorrow. Mark had patrolled past it countless times, never with reason to enter. Until tonight. The orphanage loomed like a tomb. Its windows were jagged black holes, its doors sagging on rusted hinges. As Mark crossed the threshold, the smell of mildew and decay hit him, mingled with something older, something that clung to the walls like regret. His flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness, illuminating peeling wallpaper and graffiti scrawled by daring teenagers. The floor creaked beneath his boots, loud in the oppressive silence. Somewhere deeper inside, he heard a faint noise, a rustle, a breath quickly sucked in. Mark's pulse quickened. He moved toward the sound, careful to avoid loose boards. Behind a broken cabinet, he found a hidden alcove. 2 small figures huddled together in the shadows. The older boy, maybe 6, had his arms wrapped protectively around the younger one. Their faces were pale, dirt-smudged eyes wide with fear. Mark lowered himself slowly, trying not to startle them. The younger boy clutched the teddy bear tighter, shrinking back. The older one, Caleb, as he would later learn, met Mark's gaze with wary defiance. His voice was a whisper hoarse from disuse. "They said he was dead," Caleb murmured, jerking his chin toward the smaller boy. "Said he died with Mom and Dad, but they lied." Mark's throat tightened. Caleb's next words chilled him. "There's a man, a cop. Red hair, scar by his eye. He has the keys to this place." Mark's mind raced. Red hair, scar, Greg. No, he pushed the thought aside. It couldn't be Greg. The sound of a door creaking open jolted them all. Mark swung his light toward the entrance just as another figure appeared. Greg Dalton himself, breathing hard as if he'd run to catch up. "Mark," Greg called, his voice tinged with concern. "Heard you on the radio. You okay, Mark?" Exhaled relief, warring with unease. Together, they led the boys out of the orphanage. Caleb clung to Mark while the younger one, Oliver, stumbled silently beside them, never letting go of his beer. As they approached the edge of the woods, Greg hung back, pulling out his phone. His voice dropped to a near whisper, carried away by the wind. "We found them," he said. Mark didn't hear. He was too focused on the trembling children, unaware that the night's rescue had set in motion something far darker than he imagined, and far deadlier. The forest surrounding the cabin was silent except for the restless whisper of leaves stirred by an autumn wind. Inside the small wooden structure, the air was thick with tension and the faint scent of wood smoke. Mark Sullivan crouched near the hearth, adding a log to the fire as his eyes drifted toward the two boys seated on a threadbare couch. Oliver sat with his teddy bear pressed firmly to his chest, his gaze fixed on the flames. The flickering light cast trembling shadows across his delicate features, highlighting the dirt streaked along his cheeks and the thinness of his arms. Beside him, Caleb sat upright, his small shoulders squared in a posture that seemed far too mature for his 6 years. His eyes never stopped scanning the room, watching the windows, the door, even Mark himself. The boy had become a sentinel, the kind of child forced to grow up too fast to carry burdens no one his age should ever know. Mark felt a sharp pang in his chest as he watched them. His own son had once sat like that, legs tucked beneath him as he listened to bedtime stories. But Noah's eyes had been carefree, unclouded by terror. Seeing Caleb so guarded, so ready to flee or fight, was a cruel reminder of what innocence stolen looked like. He reached into a cupboard, retrieving a tin of soup and setting it to warm on the stove. The mundane act felt strangely significant. These children had been running, hiding, surviving on scraps and fear. Offering them something as simple as a hot meal was a small rebellion against the darkness that had consumed their young lives. Caleb's voice, quiet and hesitant, broke the silence. "They said Oliver died. They told everyone." Mark turned slightly, careful not to move too quickly. Caleb's tone was flat, but beneath it Mark heard the echo of grief and rage. "They said it was an accident," Caleb continued. "Mom and Dad were going to tell something important. Then the car crashed. But Oliver wasn't in it. His small hand tightened into a fist. They took him instead." Mark swallowed hard. His police instincts stirred, colliding with his personal anguish. A cover-up, he thought. Deliberate, calculated. The details didn't fully connect yet, but the outlines of a conspiracy were emerging. The following morning brought a pale, brittle sunlight that did little to ease the sense of unease lingering in the cabin. Mark had barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of branches outside felt like a threat poised to strike. As the children dozed under a quilt, Mark sat at the table with a worn notebook spread before him. He had begun jotting fragments of information. Caleb had shared names, half-whispered places mentioned only once. The most chilling detail was the mention of a man with red hair and a scar by his eye, someone Caleb claimed had the keys to the orphanage. The description twisted Mark's gut every time he thought about it. It matched Greg Dalton perfectly, but no. Greg was his friend, his partner, the man who had held Mark upright when Noah went missing, who had led search parties, who had sat with him during long nights of despair. It couldn't be Greg. The cabin door creaked open, breaking his reverie. Emily Carter stepped inside, brushing leaves from her jacket. She had driven in from the state police headquarters at Mark's urgent request, her face a careful mask of professionalism. "Mark," she said, her tone both brisk and concerned. "You sounded different on the phone. What's going on?" He gestured toward the sleeping boys. "Found them last night, hiding at St. Helena's." Emily's eyes widened as she knelt beside the couch, examining Oliver and Caleb with a practiced gaze. "They're filthy, but alive," she murmured. This is bigger than a missing persons case." Mark gave a tight nod. "Caleb said there's a cop involved, someone with access." Emily's jaw clenched. "Internal corruption. I don't know yet." The words tasted like ash. Emily straightened her gaze sharp. "We need to move them to protective custody. Now." Mark hesitated. The idea of handing the boys over to a system that might already be compromised filled him with dread. He had trusted the system once, and Noah had vanished anyway. "Not yet," he said finally. "Let me figure out what we're dealing with first." Dog. Later that day, as Mark rummaged through a pile of blankets, his hand brushed against something hard hidden within the stuffing of Oliver's beloved teddy bear. He paused, frowning, then carefully tore open the seam. A small, unmarked USB drive slid into his palm. For a long moment, Mark simply stared at it. His pulse thundered in his ears as possibilities raced through his mind. This wasn't a toy. This was evidence, something deliberately hidden, where only someone desperate and clever would think to look. He plugged the drive into his old laptop, holding his breath as folders appeared on the screen. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. Children. Different ages, different faces, each image clinical and cold. Alongside the photos were spreadsheets filled with cryptic codes and dates. At first glance, it looked like shipping manifests. Mark's vision swam. The implication was horrifying. These weren't just missing kids. They were commodities tracked and moved like cargo. Then he saw a photo that froze him completely. Noah. His son's innocent face stared back at him from the screen. Older now by 3 years, his eyes wide with fear. Next to the image was a series of numbers and letters SID 051922. A destination was listed beneath it. Sydney, Australia. The room tilted. Mark gripped the edge of the table, fighting for breath. Noah wasn't dead. He hadn't drowned, as everyone had claimed. He had been taken stolen from the lake that day and shipped across the world like contraband. A sound escaped Mark's throat, part sob, part roar. The truth was worse than his nightmares. His son had been alive all this time, suffering while Mark mourned an empty grave. Emily appeared at his side, drawn by the commotion. She scanned the screen, her face draining of color. "Mark? Oh my God!" He turned to her, eyes blazing. "They took him, Emily. They took my boy." That night, danger arrived without warning. Mark was preparing to leave with the boys when headlights flared outside the cabin. The low growl of engines echoed through the trees, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. His instincts screamed at him ambush. He grabbed Caleb and Oliver, shoving them toward the back door. Stay low. Stay silent. The cabin exploded into chaos as armed men poured through the front, led by a familiar figure. Greg Dalton. Mark's world shattered in an instant. Greg's expression was unreadable, but his gun was steady. "Step aside, Mark," he called. "We'll take it from here." Betrayal hit like a physical blow. Every memory of their friendship twisted into something rotten. "No," Mark whispered, though the word felt powerless. Bullets tore through the cabin walls as Mark fired back, scrambling to protect the children. Emily returned fire from outside, her sharp commands cutting through the smoke and noise. The fight spilled into the forest. Branches whipped against Mark's face as he carried Oliver Caleb stumbling beside him. Behind them, flames devoured the cabin, turning their sanctuary into an inferno. Greg pursued relentlessly. At the edge of a clearing, Mark turned to face him. The two men collided in a brutal struggle, fists and fury replacing words. Greg was stronger, but Mark's desperation gave him an edge. "You knew," Mark snarled, landing a blow that split Greg's lip. "You led me in circles while my son was out there." Greg's laughter was bitter, jagged. "Orders, Mark. Everything I did was orders. You think you're the only one who lost something? We're pawns. All of us." The name slipped from Greg's mouth, then a final poisonous truth. Whitman. The mayor's name cut through the night like a blade. Mark froze, horror dawning. The mayor, Greg, gave a bloodied smile. "You never suspected, did you?" In that split second of hesitation, Greg lunged. The struggle ended with a single, deafening shot. Greg staggered backward, eyes wide with shock, then collapsed into the dirt. The forest fell silent except for the distant crackle of the burning cabin. Emily arrived moments later, breathless and armed, her face pale as she took in the scene. Mark knelt beside Greg's lifeless body, chest heaving. He said, "Whitman." Mark rasped. "The mayor's behind this." Emily's gaze hardened. The man who publicly championed children's welfare, who had everyone's trust, was the very monster orchestrating their suffering. "This isn't just local," she said, glancing at the USB still clutched in Mark's fist. "These codes, these destinations, it's international. A whole network." Mark's hands trembled as he thought of Noah half a world away waiting for rescue that might never come. Caleb appeared then, silent tears streaking his dirty cheeks. He held out Oliver's teddy bear, now stitched clumsily where Mark had opened it. The boy's eyes were full of understanding far beyond his years. "They'll come again," Caleb said simply. Mark nodded, the weight of the promise settling on his shoulders. Let them come. He stared into the darkness, knowing the battle ahead would be unlike anything he'd faced before. Behind them, the fire consumed the last remnants of his old life, lighting the forest with an orange glow. And somewhere in the heart of Brookhaven, Mayor Whitman smiled for the cameras, his hands clean, his secrets hidden, at least for now. Morning arrived thin and gray over Brookhaven, a paler version of day that felt reluctant to commit. The town woke to the steady hum of news vans and the soft thud of newspapers on porches. Headlines spoke in careful curated words about generosity and leadership, about the mayor's new initiative to expand services for at-risk children. Cameras framed the brick facades and tidy lawns, and a practiced voice narrated the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Mark Sullivan watched from the edge of it all, a silhouette behind the windshield of an unmarked car. He parked beneath an elm that had already surrendered half its leaves to the curb. The streets had been swept for the cameras, but the drains still held their secrets. Cigarette filters, a ribbon of lost plastic, a scatter of maple seeds like tiny propellers that never truly lift. On the screen inside a storefront window, Mayor Charles Whitman stood behind a podium garlanded with cheerful pennants. His expression was serene, his delivery precise. He spoke of family and safety, of the duty to protect. He promised warmth as if he controlled the seasons. His hands rested on the edges of the lectern like a man holding a boat steady for others to climb aboard. Mark's jaw ached. Somewhere under the weight of that measured voice lay a ledger filled with numbers and names. Somewhere, an engine idled at a dock not far from where the lake widened and deepened, and behind a corrugated door a line of containers waited with doors shut like sealed mouths. Somewhere the world made room for silence because men had asked it to. He turned the key and drove away before the applause began. By noon, the town had chosen a story. A rumor moved like a draft beneath doors and up stairwells. Officer Mark Sullivan had taken 2 boys from a safe house. He had acted alone. He had been unstable for years. He had sworn he saw his lost child everywhere and finally had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Words were repeated, slightly changed, and then repeated again with the confidence of familiarity. Concerned neighbors became witnesses. The town's memory adjusted around him as if it had always intended to. Mark sat in a narrow room at the edge of a state facility, a map unrolled across the table like a wound. Emily Carter stood at the window with her arms folded, watching the parking lot for patterns that might suggest an ambush. She carried herself like a length of cable-flexible tensile made to take a load. On a second table lay the remnants of the teddy bear, its hastily repaired seam, a pale scar across faded plush. The USB drive sat in a clear bag beside it, accusatory even in silence. The plan took shape without ceremony. A dockside warehouse. A midnight transfer, a supervising team that was not on any official schedule, a manifest that didn't match known cargo. A chain of calls had betrayed itself by calling too often, too neatly, too late. Emily spoke only what was necessary, laying out routes and contingencies. Mark added the rhythm of the lake, the seasonal habits of the men who worked its margins, the stubborn way fog clung to certain coves like a superstition. Caleb listened with a stillness that belonged to an older person. Oliver, wrapped in a borrowed sweater, traced the outline of the bear's stitched back with one small finger, as if the seam might open again and spill one last secret onto the table. When it was time to move, Emily knelt to meet the boy's eyes. Her words were steady and unadorned. Stay with the designated officer, keep low move when told. She did not promise what she couldn't guarantee. She promised only that she would not stop, and if the boys were watching closely, and they would see that she meant it. Outside, the day slipped into a narrow dusk, the color of a bruise resolving to yellow and gray. Mark drove without the radio, taking roads that had not yet learned his tires. The town thinned into warehouses and fenced lots and the long shadow of the grain elevator. The lake waited beyond a sheet of metal laid flat to the horizon. In the rearview mirror, Oliver's reflection held to the bear like a life raft. Caleb kept his gaze on the passing fences, counting bolts without moving his lips. They arrived early because being early was a way of making time, the thing that bent, not them. Emily's team hand-picked and briefed on paper that would be ash by morning, dispersed without chatter. There would be no sirens. Only footfalls, only air drawn through teeth, only gloved hands that preferred not to touch at all. The warehouse sat indifferent to them, a slab of corrugation with numbers fading on its flanks. Its door was a strip of darker dark. The dock beyond was almost empty. A forklift sat angled like a shoulder. Farther out, mooring ropes wrote long lines across wet timber, and a barge hunched as if answering a low question. Emily touched the earpiece and nodded once. Mark felt the small words of the movement more than he heard any instruction. They walked. Inside, the air was cold and tasted of rust. The light was the kind that had agreed to be paid by the hour. Crates were stacked like obedient habits. A corridor of containers had been drawn down the center of the space, their doors closed, their metal skins branded with stenciled codes that loved secrecy more than truth. Sometimes the world did what numbers told it to. Mark paused. In the thin space under the nearest door, a line of light had tried to escape and failed. He leaned close and heard it, the soft, staccato rhythm of breath. Many breaths timed by fear into the same small tempo. He raised 2 fingers. Emily's team fanned out. A bolt cutter kissed steel. A hinge resented the idea of moving. Then the door gave. Air rushed in. Silence. Then a chorus of tiny sounds, the body's own language when words had been denied, the catch of a throat, the involuntary step backward from bright, the thin thread of a sob. A dozen faces and then more, swimming up from the dim interior. Some stood. Some sat as if their muscles had decided that hope was both too much and not enough. A hand reached out, then retreated. A boy closed his eyes against the light and opened them again as if teaching himself not to fear it. Mark counted. Counting was the only prayer he remembered. The second container answered like the first. The third held fewer children, but more blankets, as if someone wanted to be remembered as careful. By the fourth, the warehouse had learned their names, even if only in echo. One container was empty. Its smell was chemical and absolute. They closed it again and moved on. A footstep sounded behind them, too clear to be a mistake. The voice that followed was low and official, a tone that had escorted citizens through ribbon cuttings and town halls and televised reassurances. It did not belong to a warehouse. It did not belong tonight. Officer Sullivan. Mark turned slowly. Mayor Charles Whitman stood in the warehouse aisle with his hands folded lightly before him as if attending a dedication. He wore no tie. His coat was unbuttoned. There was nothing in his hands except a patience he had cultivated for years. Emily eased a half-step toward him, shoulder slightly forward, the human equivalent of a shield raised. The team had trained for men like this whose power liked to sound reasonable. The mayor's gaze traveled over the scene, the door pried open, the small faces, the scatter of blankets. His expression altered by degrees, stopping at an approximation of concern. "I understand what this looks like," he said. Emily's answer was procedural and clean. She named the statutes that had been violated, the agencies that had been notified, the legal authority that brought her here. She asked that he surrender, that he place his hands where they could be seen, that he honor the office he'd used like a key. She asked it the way a person asks oxygen to behave. Whitman glanced at her, then at Mark, and finally at the boys. For a moment his face relented into something almost human. Perhaps he saw a version of himself in some distant reflection. Perhaps he only saw the end of a long arrangement. He sighed, the sound of a door closing somewhere else. Then he smiled, and it was the smile Mark had watched daily on screens and banners, the expression that looked like leadership when photographed from a distance. "You think this ends here," Whitman said softly. "You think you have the shape of it because you can see a corner. His eyes returned to Mark and lingered as if selecting the right place to affix a label. "You're looking for a boy," he said. "Your boy. You have been looking for him since the day it happened. In lakes, in woods, in faces that were not his. You're looking still." The warehouse listened. Even the lights seemed to hold themselves steady. Whitman's voice dropped until the words were almost private. "Sydney. A new name, a school uniform, a photograph with someone else's arms around him. A child adapts. That's what the world says will save him." The sentence was a wire drawn through Mark's chest. He did not move. He imagined that if he moved, the words would tear. For a fraction of a second he saw it, a boy standing in an unfamiliar doorway. A lunchbox in one hand, a polite expression on his face because he had learned that polite faces made days easier. The crescent birthmark on his shoulder would be hidden by crisp cotton. His new name would be written inside the collar in careful, hopeful letters. Emily spoke his name once. It was enough to bring him back. Whitman tilted his head. "You think this is a monster's story. It isn't. It's a ledger story, debits and credits. A current that carries everything not nailed to the shore. Children are buoyant, officer. They float." For the first time, Mark took a step toward him. The sound his boot made on the concrete was quiet, but it was the sound of a choice. Behind him, a small hand tugged at his sleeve. Caleb stood there grave as a clerk, holding something flattened and worn. It was a photograph curled at the edges and the image softened by countless thumbprints. He had taken it from a room at the mayor's residence, a wall of faces that had tried to grow into inventory. The picture showed a boy half-turned toward the camera, a wet shore behind him, a sky the color of tin. The boy's mouth was set not to cry. On the back, in block letters, SID 051922. Caleb pressed the photo into Mark's hand and looked up at him with a steadiness that required no words. Mark felt the paper like heat. "Enough," Emily said. "No rhetoric, no condemnation. A word used the way a surgeon uses a suture." Her team closed the distance. Cuffs answered wrists. Procedure asserted its right to exist. Whitman did not resist. He only watched Mark as the space between them changed from public to private and back again. As they led him past the open containers, the mayor glanced at the children and arranged his mouth into something sorrowful, like a man who had tried his best and regretted being misled by his own kindness. When he was gone, the warehouse breathed differently. The wind found its way under the doors, and somewhere a chain clinked, relieved to have been noticed. They began the work of names. Each child acquired one, if not the one given at birth, then the one that would carry them forward safely. A first aid kit opened and transformed into a promise. Bottles of water lost their anonymity. A medic murmured the liturgy of reassurance. "You are here. You are seen. Your body is yours again." Oliver stood beside Mark the bear, pinned under his chin, the seam aligned with his cheek like a secret whispered close. He leaned calmly into the side of Mark's leg and did not move until he felt the man's breath change. Outside, the lake threw a skim of light at the dock. An ambulance idled without sirens. The night gathered itself for the next task. News broke before dawn. The headlines were careful again, but the photographs were not. No camera could make a container look like anything but a container. No lens could rearrange a child's eyes into an adult's idea of what ought to be. The town's story changed a little, then a lot. Concerned neighbors became witnesses for a different reason. In the cafe where the morning crowd practiced the discipline of opinions, a television ran without sound. Whitman's face appeared between graphics. His tie was still missing. A woman covered her mouth with her hand. A man closed his eyes the way one does when a song from childhood arrives uninvited. At a state facility far from the town square, two boys sat at a table with a social worker who knew that words had to be offered like water, not like instruction. Oliver concentrated on a set of crayons, orchestrating colors into a bear that was both truer and more hopeful than the real one. Caleb arranged a deck of cards into precise stacks, the order doing a job that none of the adults could yet do for him. Mark stood in a room with a laptop open to a video platform, its blue banner waiting like a held breath. He had not slept. He had bathed, but could not have said what temperature the water had been. Emily sat in a chair near the door, posture loose in that deliberate way that means readiness. She had made calls through the night to people who answered on the first ring because the world had made them into people who always did. The screen blinked, then steadied. A woman appeared, her face pale with the effort of a difficult generosity. Next to her, a boy settled with the competent awkwardness of 7. His hair was shorter now. His skin held a different season. He wore a polo shirt the color of new grass. He looked into the camera the way a person looks into a mirror, not entirely convinced it reflects them. For a moment, neither side spoke. Audiobook stories prefer silence when silence is truer. Mark's hand hovered up then down as if testing the weight of a word. When he finally used his voice, it was careful enough to carry glass across a crowded room. Noah, he said, and the name was both a memory and a call. The boy blinked. The woman touched his shoulder in the lightest of ways. The boy's mouth softened, then tightened again. Children are not immune to distance. They are simply less practiced at pretending it isn't there. Christopher, the woman murmured the name that had kept him safe in a place that asked for one. The boy gave the faintest nod. He did not repeat it. Mark did not say the rehearsed things. He did not tell a story of bravery or retrieval. He let the screen hold what it would. He spoke about the lake in winter, about how the ice pretends to be ground and then changes its mind. He spoke about a paper boat that once made it from one end of a puddle to the other. He spoke about a drawing of a crescent moon on a shoulder the ink smudged because the artist could not wait for it to dry. The boy's eyes lifted. He touched his shoulder reflexively, then seemed surprised by the motion. Something moved in his face, recognition or its ghost, and then fled again, shy of being watched. "It's okay," Mark said, and the two small words built a bridge that was not yet strong enough to carry weight, but might be in time. The woman whispered that there would be more calls, that there were counselors who understood that paperwork could be patient when people could not. Emily thanked her with a gratitude that did not require anyone to forgive anything immediately. When the call ended, the room accepted sound again. Mark closed the laptop with a care that suggested the boy might still be inside it sleeping. Outside the door, Oliver and Caleb waited. Oliver's picture had acquired a son and a small boat. Caleb had transformed 2 decks into 4, then reduced them again. They looked up together and did not ask questions because they had learned that adults sometimes answer the same question twice in different ways. Mark knelt. Oliver leaned into him with the instinct small bodies have when a large one is safe. Caleb placed a card on Mark's knee as if knighting him a king not of hearts but of something more durable, spades the tool you use to dig. By afternoon, the town tried forgiveness on like a coat borrowed from a neighbor, a little big at the shoulder sleeves, too long. Some wore it by habit, some by principle, some because there was nothing else handy that wasn't either rage or shame. The trees let go of more leaves. The schools let out early. Somewhere, a church opened its side door and reintroduced the smell of coffee and floor polish to a community that had not realized how much it missed them. Mark walked to the lake. The shore was littered with the small conversations the water had with itself, a language of ripples and retreats. Emily joined him, not because he asked, but because she knew the difference between solitude and abandonment. They stood the way colleagues stand who have seen each other inside events that will never fully translate into language for anyone else. He spoke about a promise he had made to a screen. He spoke about a boy who might never call him by the name he wanted to hear. He spoke about patience as if it were a place you could move to and file a change of address. Emily listened and let the silence between his sentences keep its shape. On a rock near the waterline, Oliver arranged small stones into a careful arc. Caleb corrected the arc once, then let it be. The bear sat upright, concentrating. The wind shifted, carrying the damp iron smell of the dock. Somewhere behind them, phones sang their bright, habitual songs. A team cataloged evidence in a building that had preferred to be anonymous. A clerk opened a file and, without thinking, saved it with a human name instead of a number. At the water's edge, Mark spoke without turning. "We keep going." Emily answered with the simplest agreement in the language she and he shared. "We do." Night returned a final time, soft and deliberate. Brookhaven street lamps found their purpose again, outlining porches and fences and the backs of chairs. In a warehouse office that would soon be emptied of everything that had made it useful, a phone vibrated against a metal desk. No one was there to answer. The screen glowed to the ceiling, lighting dust that had never once cared what it floated through. The message was short and as ruthless as a formula: next shipment 20. Destination EU. The sender's number was a country code that had not appeared in any previous folder. Networks resist endings. They prefer rerouting. The phone buzzed twice more and then went quiet, exhausted by its own clarity. The camera of imagination widened. Silver Pine Lake exhaled a pain of darkness broken by the irregular logic of stars. In a state facility, a boy slept with a bear held against his chest. In another country, a boy lay awake and tried out 2 names in his mouth like coins, not yet choosing which one to spend. In the middle distance, a car moved with its lights off toward a place that shouldn't have to exist. Somewhere between all the locations a promise walked, "You are not forgotten." Ted. If this story has held you, if the quiet parts felt as true as the loud ones, consider subscribing so you'll be with us when the next search begins. Days later, Mark returned to the elementary school Noah had once attended. He stood by the playground fence while children invented rules for games that did not need them. A patch of asphalt held the ghost of a hopscotch grid. He imagined a future in which a boy with one name or another might run here again and discover that muscles remember joy. He imagined standing far enough away not to embarrass him, but close enough to be summoned with a look. He did not rehearse any lines. He did not carry flowers or proof. He carried the practice of showing up. Across the street, a small bookstore propped its door open with a stack of last season's calendars. The bell above the frame read every entry as a possible blessing. Inside, a display of audiobooks waited with the patience of objects that know time is their ally. The owner glanced at the door the way shopkeepers do when they have learned that the person they want to see is often the next one. If stories like this help you make sense of the night, if you want the next chapter, the moment it arrives, tap subscribe. Your presence lets us keep the light on. In Brookhaven, the Harvest Festival resumed on a smaller scale. No banners, fewer speeches. A table offered hot cider and the dignity of paying only what you could. The old bandstand gained new boards that didn't creak under the weight of regrets. A child's drawing of a bear appeared on a bulletin board without a name or caption. Someone tucked a fresh crayon behind the thumbtack in case the artist returned to add a sun. On the courthouse lawn, a plaque replaced a sign. It did not praise a leader. It listed first names that could not safely be listed in full. Below them, a sentence that tried to be both invitation and vow. "We saw you. We see you." Mark read it once and did not read it again. He turned toward the road that led to the lake because water is a place where stubborn men relearn the difference between force and persistence. Emily fell into step beside him, hands in pockets, steps matched without negotiation. Behind them, Oliver and Caleb followed their strides longer than they had been a week ago. They reached the shore at an hour when the sky couldn't decide between blue and the darker shade that follows it. The boys began to build again, stones in an arc. Then a second arc below it, the shape suggesting something both sheltering and open like ribs that had decided to become a doorway. The bear supervised as bears do from a vantage point that saw everything. Mark breathed. It was not easier. It was simply possible. If you want to stand with them when the phone in a foreign office lights up again, when a code becomes a street, when a street becomes a door, subscribe now so the journey finds you as soon as it moves. The lake kept its own counsel. The wind nudged the water toward the stones, and away again, teaching a lesson as old as weather approach, retreat, return. Somewhere far off, a gull argued with a current. Somewhere closer, a boy laughed without worrying first if he was allowed. The night arrived, and with it the promise that morning would have another chance. In the ledger, The World Keeps for Itself, a new column had been added, Unruled and Stubborn Mercy. It refused neat arithmetic. It balanced nothing. It only insisted on being counted. Mark lifted his face to the dark and did the smallest, bravest thing a person can do after too much has been asked of him. He waited without hating the waiting. The shore held. The boys built. The story for now ended exactly where it needed to, not with triumph, but with a place to stand.